Good morning. The Community and Technical College Formula Advisory Meeting is called to order. I am Dr. Pamela Anglin from Paris Junior College, serving as chair. Please be advised that this meeting is being broadcast over the internet and recorded, so I would ask all attendees to silence your cell phones. For those attending via teleconference, please mute your phone until you are ready to speak. This prevents background noise. Thank you. We have a full agenda this morning, so let's begin by calling the roll. Mr. Gilmore, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Chet Lewis.
Here.
Mr. Cesar Maldonado.
Here.
Dr. Van Miller.
Here.
Mr. Patrick Lee.
Here.
Mr. Richard Cervantes.
Here.
Ms. Mary Wickland.
Here.
Mr. Jim Yiannopoulos, who is not here. Mr. Michael Reeser.
Here.
Dr. Robert Raza, excuse me. Dr. Pam Anglin.
Here.
Dr. Ron Clinton is not here. Dr. Jeremy McMillan.
Here.
Dr. Phil Rhodes is not here as well. So we're good.
Yeah. A quorum is present. So as a reminder, members on the call are permitted to vote, and I don't believe we have anyone on the phone
That is
today.
correct. All three said they would not be able to attend.
Item 2 is consideration and approval of the minutes from August 31st, 2017 meeting, and the draft meeting minutes were included in the meeting materials. Do members have comments, questions, or corrections to the draft minutes?
I offer in the spirit of goodwill that my friend and colleague Cesar Maldonado holds an earned doctorate from Guns Up, Texas Tech University, and perhaps the record should show him as Dr. Maldonado. He's too modest to correct it himself, so I'd do it on his behalf.
So noted.
Okay. Thank you. Do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
Second.
Motion by Richard Cervantes and a second by Van Miller. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Those opposed, same sign. Minutes are approved. We'll move to agenda item number 3. Item 3 is discussion, review, and consideration of the Commissioners' 2020-2021 biennium charges. We're going to start with Charge 3. And Charge 3 is to study and make recommendations on the treatment of competency-based courses and formula allocations. Staff provided background information regarding competency-based education in the materials for this meeting. We will hear from Dr. Julie Eklund, who will provide an overview of competency-based education. Dr. Eklund.
Thank you, Dr. Anglin. I've just put together a broad overview of competency-based education. We actually have someone on our academic quality and workforce staff who was unable to be with us today, who is expert in this area related to the programming side, so we'll see if she can join at a later meeting. But I wanted to provide you some background and also talk about a change that has happened for this fall, just a temporary fix, if you will, in terms of reporting competency-based education, and talk a little bit more about your charge in relation to reporting competency-based education that's tied to contact hours. So first of all, I just wanted to share a definition that we've been using here and that we shared in your materials. Competency-based education allows students to progress towards completion, often at their own pace as they demonstrate mastery, measured through authentic assessment of a defined set of knowledge and skills. CBE programs may be organized around traditional course-based units, but this is not required. A majority of the curriculum must include regular and substantive interaction with the faculty. And again, we'll be focusing particularly today on those courses that are organized around the traditional units. Okay, this is just a little bit of an overview of traditional versus competency-based in terms of time and mastery. So generally with traditional courses, the time is fixed and the learning is variable. CBE, the learning is fixed and the time is variable. In terms of traditional coursework, some students demonstrate mastery, others may not. And for competency-based, all students demonstrate mastery as they move forward. So usually the way those programs work, a student can't move to the next module or level until they've successfully shown that they've mastered the material and the area they're working on. So there are some characteristics that are commonly seen with CBE. So here's just some of those things: self-paced, accelerated, etc. These don't always apply, but often they do. And then here's a sort of general framework. CBE usually involves things like disaggregated staffing, alternative financial models, etc. Instruction is obviously a key component of competency-based education and for our regional accreditors, and the programs must ensure that students have access to quality faculty, and again, that regular and substantive interaction is occurring. So in terms of mapping back to the credit hours, some do. The semester credit hours are, of course, to the contact hours for the purposes of accreditation, financial aid, transcription, and transferability. There is a national movement happening to break from that. It's been very challenging in terms of thinking about financial aid. I know the federal government has some pilots that have been going on in terms of looking at some CBE that isn't mapped back to semester credit hours or contact hours. And I think when Dr. Nalis comes and presents to you, she'll be able to provide a little more detail on that. But basically, again, as I said, we want to focus today on the semester credit hours and the contact hours. So I wanted to talk about what programs are currently in the works in Texas. I think most of you are probably familiar with the CBE programs, the Affordable Baccalaureate programs and organizational leadership that are at A&M Commerce and South Texas College. We also have some new TAB programs. There was a grant that we got some funding for to put out from the coordinating board, and Tarleton State College, Austin Community College, and A&M Corpus are now going to be, or have started competency-based programs as a result of that, and A&M Commerce and South Texas College have added some programs to their list of offerings. Here's a little bit of background about the organizational leadership program that has been in place in the state since 2014. This is a bachelor's degree. They have graduated a couple of classes of students now. It is still a fairly small program in terms of numbers. But now let's focus on the funding for competency-based education, and I want to talk a little bit about the history of what's happened with that funding with this committee. So the state formula funding for that organizational leadership program that's at Commerce and South Texas College was set up so that courses were reported at the end of the semester and only reported for funding for students who had successfully completed all of the modules, all of the work affiliated with the course. So the student, again, had to have successfully mastered the content. That means all of it was being reported to us in a flex situation. That agreement was put in place when those programs began, but I think it's important to remember there were substantial startup funds that were provided for those programs. So the work in terms of putting the courses together, there were startup funds available. The recommendations that were made from both the GAI and the CTC's committee are included here. They weren't the same recommendations made to the legislature in the last session for the 18-19 biennium. The general academic institutions recommended that only the competency-based courses that were successfully completed be funded, and then the board and the commissioner concurred with that, but they included an additional 10% bump in the recommendation to help pay for costs affiliated. That is not something that was adopted. In terms of the community and technical colleges, the recommendation from this committee was that the competency-based be funded the same as traditional courses. Again, those programs that are tied to semester credit hours, and that's pretty much what we've seen because of some of those challenges. The board did not concur with that, and they recommended the same approach as the GAIs. With the now expansion with the TAB programs and these new programs starting up, and again, the grant funding was, I think, much more limited for those programs, decisions needed to be made about what funding was going to look like, what reporting was going to look like for this fall. And the coordinating board sent a memo to institutions in August with some guidelines for reporting competency-based education. For the first time, a code was added to the CBM report so that folks doing competency-based education could report it through the manual. And the instructions were that a student could be reported by the census date if the student had begun engaging with the course materials. Now, these instructions were sent out as just guidelines for this fall. And it's important to remember this fall is not part of a baseline. And that's why this is really important work that this committee needs to do in terms of making recommendations for funding that competency-based education that is linked to traditional coursework. So this fall, the commissioner made the decision in consultation with several folks that it was, he felt it was very important to provide funding for these programs, to encourage these types of programs. So he thought for this fall, let's put forth that institutions can report all that coursework in the traditional pattern as long as there was some sign of students engaging with the coursework. And then I'm going to skip 2 slides here. I'm sorry if I was off. But then for students who had signed up for a course, but there were no indications whatsoever that the students were engaging in the work, it might be something that they planned to start later, so they maybe signed up for 4 CBE courses, but only began 2 of them. The instructions were that a student could be reported as flex once the student had actually begun working on that, doing the work as part of the course. And if a course was going to span semesters, it could only be reported once, so you wouldn't have a situation where a student signed up for a CBE course in the fall, was reported to us as enrolled, and then the course didn't complete, because these courses, again, are non-traditional often in terms of time frame. If the student signed up again the next spring, it would only be reported to us once. So we provided instructions to institutions for how to report those CBE courses again for this fall. As we were talking about this, there were some concerns about situations where you might have students sign up for a lot of CBE coursework and then really not complete. And now with our student schedule report, we actually get grades, we get completions, we get withdrawals, we get specific information about what happens to students in courses. And so the commissioner thought it was very important that we monitor what is happening with the students in those CBE courses to see what it looks like in terms of withdrawals and completes. Does it look like traditional courses? Are most students finishing, or does it look very different? Are we seeing half of the students, start something and not get through it? So that's something that we've committed to do, especially for this fall, again with this temporary arrangement in terms of reporting. So where that brings us then is to the charge for the committee to study and make recommendations for how to handle these in the formula. And as we talked about, I think it's important that some funding-based options may require legislative approval. So something where weights were changed, I think, would need to go through the legislature. There are some options that may not require legislative approval because of the authority that the coordinating board has in terms of formula funding to allocate the formula, allocate the funds that have been appropriated. So in terms of if it's a traditional, here's the funding for a particular course, decisions about is it funded at the end, is it funded about at the beginning, it's our understanding that those can happen without a legislative change. But we do have general counsel waiting in the wings, and he said he'd be happy to answer any questions from this committee should they come up regarding what options might be possible without legislative change and which ones would require some kind of a legislative change. And then finally, I do think it's important to add that I think we should have the conversation at some point around the competency-based education that isn't tied to traditional coursework, because we're seeing movement in that direction. And I think it is important to be proactive and to think about a time when students may not be signing up for 3 courses which are being offered through a competency-based format, but where they're signing up to complete a program that has material that is formatted in terms of modules or in terms of other pieces, other divisions of the work as they move through and try to master that work. And so understanding that better, what some of those models look like now, some of the innovation that's happening, and really thinking about what funding might look like for that, I think will be important. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eklund. Do we have any discussion or questions for Dr. Eklund?
Do you have a sense of the volume of CBE activity relative to non-CBE activity?
It's very small, and it really we've only collected data thus far from A&M Commerce and South Texas College. I think the students we've seen a lot of good success, especially those students have gotten through the bachelor's degrees at A&M Commerce, but the numbers are still in the hundreds in terms of the students in those programs. I think they were expecting to scale it up a little faster than they have, but now that it has been expanded and there's the additional programs being offered, and we're certainly seeing growth in other parts of the country and at some private institutions, I would anticipate we may start to see more growth. And I'd be happy to, at the next meeting, to bring you the exact numbers for where we are for those enrollments.
So you mentioned funding for non-course based CBE. No, you're not trying to tie it to a course. Do you have any models that you would ponder, or are you just asking us to ponder and bring that back to you?
Well, we'll certainly share when we have our agency expert come in and talk a little bit about what's happening around the country. We'll share some of those. It's something that we've talked about. I've seen, a lot of them are modular, and again, tied to completing a program with, and it could be, and I see Dr. Reeser's not, it could be, 30 modules or 40 modules, but they often are smaller than what you'd expect as a course. You would need to have some mechanism for that to be reported, and whether it's reported as all of the modules are completed and the whole program is completed, and you're thinking about funding on some kind of a program completion, or whether there is funding that as works with contact hours that happens for module completion. The challenge with that is I think every program's different, and it's not like 3 semester credit hours and 45 contact hours. Often for one program you might have 20 modules, and another you might have 100. Another challenge is that there's a lot of emphasis on prior learning assessment with competency-based education, and you have some situations where students are coming in, and through prior learning assessment they might be showing mastery of 80% of the material, the content in a course. You might have other students who only show mastery of 10%. Right now we have general guidelines around 50%. So you saw the slides that there needs to be some substantive interaction with faculty and with the content. I don't think folks believe that we should have the same funding for something that student is basically taking a test and showing they've mastered it versus a student who needs a lot of interaction with faculty or a coach. So again, that 50% point I think is just a guideline that's used for now in terms of reporting. Something to think about. I know another thing that Dr. Gardner has talked about is we've got CLEP tests, and we've got AP tests, and we've got other situations where students are basically doing prior learning assessment. It might not be part of a CBE model, but they're showing, I know this, and is there some place in the formula but at a much smaller amount to basically to acknowledge that there is some administrative work that is involved with testing students and providing them with credits, and there's some value in helping students get to degree by, assessing them, and if they know the material, letting them move on to the next level. Dr. Reeser, Mr. Reeser, were you going to share something there?
I really look forward to this conversation, because I think the real magic of CBE and our conventional notion of measuring education by seat time are going to come in direct conflict as we talk about this. And the fact that we continue to think of the coin of the realm as seat time as opposed to credentialing That is going to be at the core of the discussion that we have. What is it that colleges sell? Do they sell seat time or do they sell a credential? And that's at the heart of this. And there's some great metaphors like building a house. Do you want to build a house and pay for that construction 1 hour at a time? Or do you just want to pay for a house? And if the contractor brings a bunch of pre-built panels and puts them on and they work well, you still have a house with a certain value. So this will be a really interesting, it goes right to the core of how higher ed does business. It'll be a very interesting discussion.
Okay. Any other discussion? And we'll move to we're going to look at charge number 4, which is to study and make recommendations on the efficacy of critical need fields as they relate to contact hour and success point funding. We've been asked to review and discuss possible additions, deletions, or the elimination of critical fields from contact hour and success point funding. Dr. Eklund has a few comments and is available for questions.
I just wanted to briefly give you an update on the work that we did during the interim on this charge. The Formula Advisory Committee for the 18-19 biennium asked us to take a look at critical fields for this group, knowing that it had been a very long time since those critical fields had been updated, and that also there are different disciplines that are included. There's a lot of overlap, but the Cip Codes that are included for the contact hour critical field additional funding are a little bit different than those that are included for the success points, where a degree in a critical field is actually awarded 2.25 points versus 2 points. So we did a lot of work, and we came up with 3 possible options for this committee to consider that we thought made some sense in terms of looking at critical fields. But of course, we'll leave it up to you to discuss other possibilities. And if you'd like, I can share them at this time. Would that be?
Please.
Okay. So one would be to pretty much continue with the current methodology that we're using, but just to go back and look at the outdated CIP codes. There might be some CIP codes that no longer fit in terms of what we see for critical fields. I think this would result in the fewest changes, but we do see a lot of problems with the way that the critical fields work right now. You know, one I mentioned before is they're different for the two pieces of the formula funding that the CTCs receive. We also, when we talk about critical fields, and this will move us into the second option that we discussed. When we talk about critical fields, you can think about what's critical in terms of where the jobs are needed, where we're really seeing growth. But you can also think of critical as the areas where there's high demand, but there's low supply. And what we see is generally when there's high demand, your institutions do a very good job at recognizing that and meeting that demand. And we see the supply rise to meet the demand. And in areas where there's a lot of need, we see a lot of programs and we see a lot of degrees being awarded. So when we took some of the work that was done by the RAND Corporation, they did a workforce study for us. They helped us create some new matrices, and when we used the TWC data and other areas to really say, let's look at what is high demand but low supply, where we're not providing the degrees, the degree production isn't there, we found very few SIPs where that was the case. And so we were really looking at a very small amount of probably funding tied to a very small group of courses. We also, you see movement where you'll see that there's a demand, but then, and the supply isn't there, but then a few years later, you'll see that it's being met. So we said one option would be to just focus on those very small areas. And I know an exception might be something like nursing, where we see that the demand has gone and higher, and the supply has gone up, but we're still trying to get there. But in many cases, They're very specific type areas where we may not need thousands and thousands of people in those areas. It just may be a small group. And so we also want to be careful that you don't have a system that is funding an area where suddenly we have an oversupply, where we did have a demand and not enough supply. So we were, that would be one option. And for that option, we thought we would want to come up with some kind of methodology tied back to the type of work we did to identify these areas, where every perhaps 4 years or 6 years, we would rerun the analysis and come up with the new areas so that it wouldn't be 17 years. I think it's been since, about 2000, 2001, since the work was done for the contact hours. It really is something no one has seemed to have had the appetite to really dive into. So we thought that might be a piece of a recommendation that really looks at what's high demand, where we're not meeting the need, and we know we'll run those analyses. So that was another suggestion. And again, it's hard jobs are changing all the time. It's a hard thing to pinpoint, and having something that's slow moving might not meet need. And then the final thing that we did that I think had great value, and David Young did this analysis, and I'll let him jump in if I don't fully explain it, is we looked to see where the money was going to the community and technical colleges in the critical field area, and we said, well, if we remove these bumps for critical fields, how much change would it make in the formulas? And it was really very small in terms of how it changed the allocations. And I think the largest percentage that we saw on that was about, and I have it here, I think the biggest change was less than 2%. What was it, around 1.6%, something like that?
1.6%.
1.6% was the biggest change in terms of funding. And then in terms of dollar amounts, it was at one of our larger colleges, it was about $300,000.
368,000.
368,000, and that was just a half of a percentage point change. Again, that was at one of our very large community colleges. So that we aren't seeing this money, from our perspective, necessarily making a big impact in terms of the formula funding. And is it really providing? Is that really what's motivating the change in terms of meeting the demand in the field? So one thing that we talked about was that the possible option of just removing that, and obviously taking something out of the formula is going to affect the difference. In terms of success points, we thought there might be the most concern. But we've spoken with Dr. Anglin and the work group about another possibility that the group might want to think about in terms of success points that might be more tied to our state plan and where we're trying to go. And I'll let Dr. Anglin talk about that a little bit more. David, was there anything else you wanted to add to those three options?
Just wanted to add on the last option, when we ran the numbers, we were assuming that we were still talking about the same dollars that would run through the formulas. That would just be a reallocation. So we weren't talking about a total reduction in funds, but just there would be more money for the items that remained.
I was going to say, we'd be happy to share this. We just kind of wanted to introduce it today, and we'd be happy to share this work that we did and these options and any additional detail that you might like.
I think it would be good if you could share it through email with us all so that we can look at it. Cesar?
I think it'd be great to read it. There's a latency factor in responding to the market, and there's also the view of rewarding what we want to accomplish. So I think we need to overlay those two elements over the idea. I think it's a great idea, but we need to contextualize it that way.
So another way to think about your analysis, David, is for a very small amount of money, we may be driving the very behavior we see in that we are tracking highway or high demand, low supply, and that right now we are sort of married well. And so if you remove that, we may have the unintended consequence of not being married so well. I don't know that. I'm just saying you could look at that from two different perspectives.
The other piece that's a challenge, and David, correct me if I'm wrong, is biology is one of those fields also that, and I believe it's in the success points, but not the contact. Have I got that right? I think it's in one and not the other.
Maybe education.
Okay, but there are some fields that we feel like the supply might be beyond what's needed. So again, that's, and again, when you use those large 2-digit Cips, sometimes you get this mixture of areas where we really have more students than may be needed, but there are going to be some sub-disciplines, at that 8-digit Cip level where there really is a high demand. So it's always hard to know with this type of analysis how much detail, because certainly we got very granular when we said, really, where are we seeing the demand, where we're not seeing the supply, and it got to be those, sort of boutique-type programs in many cases.
In our discussion earlier this morning in the Charge 1 subcommittee work group was the possibility of adding fields of study in the success points model. And now so it would be field of study in place of the critical
Right.
fields in the success points. But we discussed that the fields of study right now are not tied, they're tied to the areas where there is the most majors in the state. Those are the ones that are being developed first, am I?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. We received legislative appropriations to develop several additional fields of study. There was a lot of emphasis on transfer during this session and a lot of concern about students who transfer and their courses don't count towards their specific degree program, even if they got transfer credit for, even if their credits transferred. And I think there was very much an interest in expanding the fields of study. Right now we see very few reported. In fact, we ran some analysis about success points and it only made about $140,000 difference. But I think the hope is that as these are expanded, they will really, it will really encourage students to get on path and on institutions to really focus on advising students to take the courses they need for their degrees and not the additional coursework. So having it as part of Success Point was something that we thought was worth raising because it might provide incentives for institutions and students to really focus on what they need for their degree and on those fields of study, because they're guaranteed to transfer if students take courses within that. Guaranteed to transfer in the degree program, right?
In our discussion this morning also, in Mary and committee, correct me, where has been on being measured to where are we linked to what the goals of 60 by 30 are as we move forward. So this committee is going to have to look at critical fields, determine our recommendation there, whether they are something that need to be continued, or if we want to look at fields of study and that affecting the success point model also. Okay. Any other discussion? Okay. Then we will move to Charge 6. Charge 6 is to review existing coordinating board data on dual credit program funding, including preliminary data available from the 2017-18 dual credit study being conducted by contracted research organizations, and share insight on current dual credit funding mechanisms. We have been asked to review and discuss dual credit funding. Dr. Eklund has a few comments and is available for questions.
Yes, just very briefly, we will provide you with the information. I think many of you have been following the work as the RAND Coordinating Board AIR study that's happening on dual credit. There is also a task force at the Texas Association of Community Colleges working in conjunction with the UT system, and there's several high-level folks around the state who are participating in that. There is a funding subgroup that actually I'm serving on. It's obviously a very important topic right now. We saw some expansion of dual credit as a result of legislative changes in the last session, trying to understand the impact of those changes from a lot of different perspectives is important, but certainly I think the funding is an issue that is on many community college leaders' minds as we've seen some changes in what's happening with dual credit. So we will provide you that information. I think the commissioner just thought it was important for all of you to take a look at what the current funding is, what some of the changes are leading to, again, in the context of all this other work that's being done around dual credit policy, rigor, some other areas. And certainly we've seen growth in the CTC, in the CTE courses at the community colleges, that those dual credit workforce education courses, we're seeing a growth there. We're seeing some other changes. We saw very rapid growth in the number of students who are enrolled. We're over 150,000 now. So just wanted to provide that background, and we're happy to bring you whatever information would be helpful to you moving forward.
Do we have any discussion on dual credit funding?
Share some of the things that I've sent out. So I was thinking about this, and I'm the lead on this, and our work group hasn't met, but we trying to work through the charge that we're given. And so you're asking us to look at the data. And so I went to the RAND study, and I scanned through there, so I've read it before, but I'm just looking from a funding perspective. And so I see 3 references to funding. One is that it describes what happens in the states. 38 states have some differential around tuition and others don't. And then funding, it describes what we do currently and the variations we have. And then in the research questions, it talks about the financial cost of dual credit programs to stakeholders, given that Texas allocates funding to both high schools and colleges. And what does that lead to in terms of semester credit hour to degree patterns at a college? In other words, looking at trying to calculate the cost of implementing dual credit programs. So I didn't see any results from that in the RAND study, and so it would be very helpful for us, if you're wanting us to look at the data, to be able to see outcomes that are occurring around that particular research question. So
Yes, and that part of that's in the phase 2 of the study. So they're just now beginning that work. And we'll be happy to share. I know there's some information that we have looked at, and in terms of the number of waivers, where the waivers are happening, and also getting an understanding of who is not charging tuition or maybe is doing partial waivers, as well as we have the information about the formula funding that is going to semester credit hours affiliated with dual credit. So we have some of that. I think some of their work is going to be qualitative, going out in the field, trying to collect some information about all these. Money moves in a lot of different directions with these dual credit programs, depending on if it's a college faculty member or a high school faculty member, on who's teaching what. There's MOUs that, in an earlier study I analyzed the MOUs, and you really see a lot of variability about where the money is coming from, which makes this a challenging topic. But we'll absolutely keep you up on where we are, and we can bring some of the folks who are working on that study here to answer any questions you might have, or even if there's particular areas that you want to make them aware of as they move forward with doing that work.
I think that would be very helpful for us, because the current report doesn't give us much direction on that. We do know the variation that occurs there.
Yeah.
So the other part of this, are we on charge 5 and 6, or just 5? Because of TSTC funding.
Yeah, we're on just 5 right now.
Okay.
Oh, we're just on no, I think we're just on 6, just the
Just on
overall
6.
funding, right?
On 6.
Do we have a report coming on 5?
It's next.
Okay. I'll just wait on that then.
Any other discussion on dual credit funding?
Do we have an idea when that phase 2 data would be available and submitted to the committee?
It's going to be after the time when this, in terms of the final report and the draft reports, it's going to be spring and summer. Some of the work is going to, some of the research will be happening this fall. So let me touch base with the researchers on which pieces they anticipate might be done, so they might have some preliminary work that they could share. And certainly if there's something this committee is interested in, we have a lot of data that we can analyze here at the coordinating board. if there's pieces that would be helpful to you. Obviously, the qualitative work and the outreach, we won't be able to do that. But if there's just in terms of helping you understand the numbers, in terms of dual credit and what the funding looks like, we're happy to do anything along those lines for you now.
Do you anticipate having any, I guess, preliminary assessments as the comparison of the funding models as it compares to the amount of rigor in the coursework itself and those successes?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure if that's something that they're going to be looking at, but let me raise that. I mean, certainly that's not something I can provide at this point. Yeah.
I listened to the webinar
Yeah, oh,
on,
yes.
on that last week, and was the depth and breadth of it's pretty wide.
Yeah.
And they're going to, the way I understood it, look at syllabus from the traditional college face-to-face class, the syllabi being used in the high school class, look in as far as looking at the outcomes, but then looking at the assignments are being made on the college class versus the dual credit class, and then at the student level work at both. Cesar?
And I think I'm taking back to the opening comments from the commissioner about in no industry would a 49% 6-year success rate for a 4-year requirement make any sense. It's we all know that that's a challenge, and I want to thank Jeremy for his work and putting the straw man together. And really, the notes he sent out took us to what's the goal before we start looking at all the numbers. And because I think if we approach it from a different frame, we're not likely to get caught up in, well, the change is only 100,000 or the change is only, because this is going to be an iterative process, I believe, before we come up with a final recommendation. And if we begin diving into the numbers and where we, as individual institutions, end up from a funding perspective, we're likely to interrupt the process of creative thought to get to perhaps a new funding formula that will get us where we want to go in the big picture. So I want to thank Jeremy for his work, and I look forward to working with everyone on it.
I think we're just now seeing the impact of those legislative changes from the 2015 session in lowering it to freshmen and sophomores and opening up the number of hours that they can take. So I think it's going to be interesting. The data's going to change significantly over the next year.
Is the early college high school part of this study also for dual enrollment?
Yes, one thing that's challenging is that the early college high schools in the past, some of them are embedded in traditional high schools, so we haven't been able to separate out those students because the way we collect dual credit data is just was the student in a dual credit course through one of our universities. The Texas Education Agency just, I think it was last year, added a flag for early college high school students. So there is a way for those students who are in the embedded early college high schools, there's a way to identify them. And so in terms of how those pieces work, when we are able to identify those students, and I'm going to have to look to the folks working on the study, I think they're trying to get some understanding of how that plays into it. I think with this expansion and allowing institutions to offer as much dual credit as they would like to students, we're also seeing some models that look like early college high schools, but they're not official TEA early college high schools, so there's some things evolving around that as well. So again, I wish we had the full picture for early college high schools, but we just haven't had that in the past. I will add that the difference with funding for early college high schools is that tuition needs, for those official TEA ones, part of the rules is that tuition cannot be charged for early college high schools. So you do have a model there where there's there's not flexibility in terms of, partial or full tuition waivers or charging tuition. It is required that the tuition's waived for those programs.
So I agree, I did send out, hey, we need to know what the goal is. So you look at some states and they said, we want to increase dual credit because we believe it leads to a more well-educated population, and they've invested in that. And many times they've invested either out of the higher ed side or the higher ed, and they've taken from or in partnership with the public ed. So obviously some people are not at the table here if we think about those types of models. But their goal was to increase that, and many of them already have more students in dual credit than we do, and they still want to increase that. We're hearing, and we believe that contributes to 30 by 60 Texas. The changing models, we need to always take care of making sure that the outcomes are as strong as they have been in the past. At my college, I don't see a radical change in the outcomes that we're seeing. They're some of our most successful students in terms of completions, whether that's with us or at a university. And so really the most successful students that we have are often our dual credit students, period. And so I believe it contributes strongly to that, but we do need to take care and make sure that the funding mechanisms don't intentionally exacerbate things that aren't as successful. And so I appreciate the care that's being taken to look at those things from the coordinating board.
Anything else? Then we'll move to charge 5, which is study and make recommendations on a new formula to fund dual credit programs based upon the number of semester credit hours offered in dual credit by Texas State Technical College. There are no recommendations from the coordinating board at this time. Do we have any discussions?
Yes, this is Mike. When the legislature was working with us through the last session on this, they asked us, do you have a preference as to which way you want to do this? Do you want to do semester credit hours, which is more like the universities, or do you want to do contact hours, or do you have some other recommendation? And what we were concerned about was the cultural changes that have occurred at TSTC over the past 8 years. The way in which, to a person, everybody has moved their obsession from contact hour and time and seat to student success is defined as they have a job and they earn a really big salary. That whole cultural thing we thought might be threatened if we went back to the credit hour system. And so we answered just rather matter of fact, well, let's go the other way, even though you could say they're very similar metrics. The truth of the matter is, based on those dialogues, I don't think the legislature will really care if TSTC were to have a system that's credit hour or contact hour. So I would suggest that what the committee consider as we study this item is that aligning TSTC's system with that of the community college system might be a really logical way to approach this. It makes it far easier on the co-board, far easier on the LBB staff, far easier on everybody else, and those data systems are already there. So I just wanted to say that although the charge calls out verbatim what the legislature called for, I was there when the legislature crafted that, and so I know that they may listen if we were to say, here's what you asked for, but here's an alternative we think actually makes more sense, and here's why. Particularly if they turned to us, TSTC, and said, do you agree? And we were able to say, yes, we do. And so I wanted to offer that up at the onset.
Thank you. Cesar?
I think we can learn from, on the tech courses, we can learn from TSTC's models and how I think if we, combining the best of both, best practices, how TSTC deals with the technical programs that are run through their system, and combining that with how we deal with the more traditional courses, we can end up with a model that that is more comprehensive.
Good point. In the RAND study, is it doing the same review with the dual credit offered by the universities as it is with the community colleges?
Yes, it's also looking at dual credit at the universities. And it's still it's 6 to 7% of all the dual credit right now. So it's still a small number, but it has grown from about 4% a few years ago.
Anything else on charge 5? We're going to move to charge 1. And charge 1 is to study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding levels for the core, contact hour, and student success funding. We were to review the information provided in the meeting materials relating to charge 1, which is to set funding level rates. Including in the meeting materials is funding projections for your consideration for the community and state colleges, which includes increases in funding as it relates to growth and inflation. Mr. Gilmore, do you want to make any comments on what's in our materials?
I can certainly do that if there are any specific questions for the particular community college piece of it. Of the projection in the materials simply just provides that, a starting place for conversation and movement among that projection. So we took all of the supporting data is above that. We're using growth based on contact hours of 3.68%. We're also using the CPIU to project the inflation rate, and we're applying those to the separate sectors in there. For contact hour the growth rate is based on that, which is in your materials above. The 3-year weighted success points is also above that, what we've had for the last 3 bienniums on those 3-year averages, which is roughly at a 7% clip as far as growth between the bienniums. Same inflation factor. Also for the Bachelor of Applied Technology, which is only associated with very few of the institutions, I use the semester credit hours that are used in that formula funding model to project the growth in that area, as well as the same 1.7% inflation. One addition to that is that we have estimated the amount of hours that Tyler College is going to come to the table with their program for this next biennium, and that's roughly at 450 hours. So that will be added to that formula. There'll be some in the appropriations, I'm sure, for the Tyler College. Now, this is, like I said, a starting point, so we can have the discussions in the committee as well as in the work group as to how we want to move between these particular funding categories.
Have any discussion, any comments?
Now, the other formula model is taking into consideration the state colleges, which have 2 primary funding areas, and same methodology was taken in that for the Lamars and state colleges. The growth rate is at a small 0.31%, and the same inflation factor is being used as well for the contact hours. And then there's also the space support, which shows a decrease in growth for their space. So we have that played in, as well as a % increase for inflation. Then there's also the small institution supplement, which probably will not change. Any questions on the way that one's done? Mary, we can have the discussions. The third model is very dear to Mr. Reeser, which is the value-added funding. I don't have the projections as yet. I have completed them, yet to be presented to the committee.
Any discussion? Did you have anything, Mary?
Well, I was just going to say that, I think I'm going to be working with Roland to change our projections here. We've had some growth at our school, LIT's had growth, and so I think that, we can work on the model, changing the model up, and, we're having troubles just like everybody else. Even though our contact hours seem to be increasing, we still have a need for, the expenses rise faster than what the funding is. So, and we've cut a lot of expenses. So anyway, we'll be working on this model.
I can certainly put those into the model. I'll send out the Excels for both the community college as
Okay.
well as the state colleges. And Mr. Reeser has his own work group for his particular formula model, and we'll work with him as well.
So Mary, would the changes being a move toward success points, or you're just saying just changes in the calculations based on contact hours?
Well, we don't have success points, so that would be a change in our whole funding stream. So, I think that we're still held accountable for success points internally in this model, but we really aren't awarded on success points. So that's something I had talked to Roland about. And, also about, we have, a large amount of technical programs. And so we have the same issue about people not completing. They get what they need, and they get their hours needed to go work in the workforce, but they might not get that certificate or whatever. So anyway, we have those issues too. So I don't know. I think it's an opportunity to look at several different modeling systems.
I agree.
Thank you. We'll move now to Charge 2, and Charge 2 is to study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding level for and the refinement of Texas State Technical College System's return value funding formula. And there's currently no funding projections for the.
That's right, but I sent out last week kind of some executive summaries on the methodology to all of the subcommittee members so that they could begin to get to know it better. It's actually fairly simple from a high-level standpoint, but there's a lot of details in the whole thing, and it's so foreign to, it's so different than the contact hour system that we spent the past week just getting acclimated. And in the weeks ahead, we'll have some subcommittee meetings, probably by phone, so that all the members of the subcommittee can get up to speed on how the process works as the co-board stands up their straw man for us to consider.
Any other discussion? Then we'll move to Agenda Item 4, which is to plan for subsequent meetings. Our next meeting is scheduled for October 12th at 1:00 p.m. And work groups should begin drafting recommendations for initial discussion by the full committee. And I will not be here on October 12th. I'll try to participate by phone, and Jeremy will chair the group. Then item 5 is adjournment. If there are no further questions or points of discussion, do I hear a motion for adjournment? Of all people, Robert. Okay. Is there a second? Okay, all in favor, say aye. Okay. The Community and Technical Colleges Formula Advisory Committee is adjourned until October 12th, 2017 at 1:00 p.m.
you.